Now,
Yeah, well, we'd like to welcome Brad Efron to talk about his Bootstrap paper. And Brad's actually all in the same building, but we're going to Zoom so we can record it. By way of personal history, I arrived here. Well, I was a student in Canada, master's student, and figuring out where to apply to grad school. And a number of my professors says you have to go to Stanford and work with Brad Efron. The guy's brilliant. So I took their advice, and I managed to get in the program. And I arrived here in 1981. By my calculation, Brad, you were about 42 at the time, right?
What year was it?
1981.
Yeah, 41 maybe. Yeah, 41.
So what was it like to win the Cops Medal just before that?
I never got the Cops Medal.
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. Okay, right.
I was 1 year too old. It started the year after I was eligible.
That's always been a sore point for you.
Well, I could have had a great life if
Anyway, so,
if I'd had that medal, things would have turned out different.
so after I arrived here, I remember started going to the seminars, and there's some guy in the front row would ask, like, I wouldn't say dumb questions, but like, what is X? What is Y? And finally I asked another student, who is that guy? And I said, that's Brad Efron. I said, that Brad Efron's asking those questions? Which I always remember that because, you know, the smartest guy in the room is asking what's X, then probably no one else knows what X is, right? So then after my first year, we talked about supervising, and you end up being my supervisor. I remember you told me that you're not a good supervisor because the problems you think of for your students are either so easy that you can finish them in an hour, or it would take you 2 years to solve. So you had trouble finding the sweet spot for thesis topics. So I signed up to work with you, and I think, as you know, you didn't help me a lot with my thesis, but the education was very rich because this was, you know, a couple of years after your Bootstrap paper. You were really, really active doing Bootstrap confidence intervals, and I got to see firsthand before anybody else sort of the wonderful results that were coming out. So it was exciting.
so I came a year before Rob, and I was excited about some course of lectures by an old professor whose name I won't mention, and so I started going to the lectures, and they weren't that exciting at all. And at the time, there was a seminar going on, a weekly seminar, which was Brad Efron teaching from his new monograph, the
Bootstrap monograph?
The Bootstrap, and Jackknife monograph.
Right.
So I went to that instead, and that was definitely worthwhile as well.
And the other thing to know about Brad is, at the time, he had maybe still has a giant pad on his desk that he writes.
Yeah.
He scribbles on. No one else can read it, but that pad is always a source of a tremendous number of ideas that you generate over there. You still have the pad?
I have the pad there.
I
I actually have two of them now because I have one at home too. However, my amount of scribbling is decreased. I need a smaller pad for retirement.
So although this is a lot of fun, we're here to talk about the Bootstrap paper. So can you tell us sort of what led up to the paper, how how it came to be?
Sure. So I was a student. I started here in '61, and Rupert Miller was my advisor. Wonderful man. Died way too young of some kind of leukemia, or blood cancer. Died in his 50s. Anyway, he at that point. The jackknife was a source of considerable excitement in the stat world, and this comes from Canui in England, and then Tukey, who put it in the form of a standard deviation estimate, and it was exciting. The term Tukey, who sometimes hit it big with names and sometimes didn't, called it the jackknife, which I never thought was a very good name. But he called it that because it could work on anything. And you know how it works. You take out one item at a time and recompute the statistic of interest, and then the variability of those deleted things give you the estimate of standard error. And it was somewhat controversial. And Rupert wrote a paper called A Trustworthy Jackknife. It had to do with when you could trust the jackknife, and it was clear that it didn't work for the median, the variability of the median. So anyway, I went in 72, 73. Rupert took a sabbatical in Imperial College, where David Cox was running the place, and I took the sabbatical that same year there. And so my wife then, Gail, my 1-year-old Miles, and I decamped for London. It was the only time I've ever lived outside the United States. It was pretty exciting. And we went there, and it was a lot of fun. And Cox, of course, was the gentle boss of the place, and we all got along together. And Rupert gave a talk about the jackknife. He wrote a paper that got fairly well known. He gave the talk, and afterwards, Cox asked me in a sort of stage whisper whether I thought there was anything to the idea. And I'm sure he was trying to encourage me to do something. And I thought about that. And I'd written, I had followed the jackknife with considerable interest. And I've been particularly interested in the infinitesimal jackknife, Louis Jekyll's version of it, in which instead of removing a full thing at a time, you removed a little piece of one observation at a time. And that made me think that the jackknife, or the infinitesimal jackknife, was a delta method estimate of something. And so the question is, what was it estimating? And I got home back from there, and that wasn't the first thing I was working on. I was working on curvature. I'd written the paper there, and Cox had really liked the curvature stuff. And that took a year or so. And then I got going on the I started thinking more about the bootstrap. Well, I thought about how you would do, what could it be a approximation to? What could the jackknife be approximation to? And I sort of had the idea of bootstrapping, now what it's called. I call it the permutation combination distribution, in analogy with the permutation distribution. And I had a sort of elaborate way of talking about it and doing it and justifying it. And I started seeing that some parts of what my elaborate methods weren't necessary. And I pulled parts of it away and away and away. And eventually I was left with the bootstrap. And it seemed awfully simple to me, maybe too simple, and not, one more device. And I gave a talk here, and Nancy Reed was in the audience, incidentally, as one of our graduate students. And she's never let me forget that. She was a student when I was an old professor. And then I gave the talk at the 1977 JSM, Joint Statistics meetings. They were in Washington. And it was a notable thing. The talk was, it was a talk that a lot of people could come to. It was given, I forgot what the name of the talk was. And
the Reitz lecture? Reitz.
Maybe it was the Reitz lecture, yeah. And Wolfowitz, there was commentary afterwards, usually, but Wolfowitz stood up and said that I didn't have any theorems there at all, and he in his usual form. And I said in my younger wise guy mode, that I didn't want to spoil a perfect effort. That was sort of the way I felt about it. It was a data analysis thing. And Betty Scott came up to me afterwards and said, that was awfully good. And that you never get comments like that. And I was encouraged, but I didn't think much of it. And then it only gradually dawned on me that I had a hit on my hands. The Breakthroughs in Statistics book was being made, and the guys wrote to me. Norman Johnson wrote to me and said, could I think of any breakthroughs? And I tried to think, and I didn't name the Bootstrap. And he wrote back and said, well, what about the Bootstrap? Mm-hmm. So I've never had a real Rob and Trevor, you guys are terrific at having hits, and I never have big hits. Most of the stuff I do is sort of too speculative or something like that. And it surprised me a lot that the Bootstrap was so successful. I can sort of see why now, and I began to see it later as I realized I could get a lot of ideas coming from the Bootstrap, like Bootstrap confidence intervals or predictions or things like that.
The fact that it was random, was that difficult for people to accept? You know, that it involved a random generation of numbers.
Yes, and that
different. Was that a problem for people to accept?
A lot of people didn't believe that it worked. Good people, I mean, not just dopes, but good people. I had a guy I was at a conference, and a nice English statistician came to me and says, "Whatever happened to the Bootstrap?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what happened to it." So it's the big hit of my academic career. It's not the thing that at the time I was writing I ever thought was so wonderful, but in retrospect, yeah, it's terrific.
Well, I remember when I was your grad student, and someone from physics asked you to come give a talk on the Bootstrap, and you were too busy. So he said, "Rob, could you go do it?" So I went over and gave just a basic talk about the Bootstrap. Again, it was at a time when, at least I was sensing that in statistics, people didn't like the fact it was a simulation, it was a random thing. The people in physics, they immediately say, "Oh, we do simulation all the time. This is like it's our bread and butter." So the fact you're doing a database simulation, that's great. I mean, they accepted it, I think, faster than people in our own field because they're so used to simulation.
Yeah, and the random aspect of it was more jarring at that time than it is now, of course. Now, just what you said is true. People just think of the computer as I used to think when I was at Caltech, e to the x or something. It's a machine that if you can reduce the problem to that, you've solved it.
Well, if there had been computers in the Bootstrap like in 1920, you think our field would be very different looking today? Like, would we have a normal distribution or T distribution? Or would we?
Yeah. I've thought of that our field developed the way it has because computing was so difficult. Yeah. And the guys like Fisher and those guys are so clever about how to avoid having to do very much computation. Right. You can sort of can it in a few tables, and then by clever ways. And Rupert Miller and Lincoln over at the medical school and Bill Brown were the champions of being able to answer any problem with a t-test and answer it quite well, usually. The kind of thinking, and the field would have developed quite differently if there had been computers available. And I don't think our elementary classes would start with t-tests and z-values and stuff like that. That's awfully hard stuff compared to sitting at your desk.
So speaking of the med school, I remember you told me one point that early in your career, you would sit in your office and think of what to work on. like dream up problems. And then you started getting more involved in the med school, and you realize that was a much better way. Like you could work with people, and they would suggest things that need working on. And isn't that the way your career has gone pretty much more recently? You're driven by applications as opposed to sort of theoretical things you dream up. Is that?
Yeah. So in some sense, it's ideal to have both things going on. I get worried when I see that people only sit at their computers all the time. And I get worried when I'm only sitting at my computer all the time. And there's the traditional way of thinking about scientific problems are the ones where you do mathematical things where you do use e to the x and sine and cosine and stuff like that is very revealing in some ways. And when it's done right, it pares the problem down to a beautiful way. And I often think of I've been writing about the ideal bootstrap, the bootstrap where you actually have infinity number of reputation. What is that like? In many ways, I just was working with Neris on a problem in med school that involved hairs in the ear of a mouse. Do they bend the right way or wrong way? That has to do with hearing. And we have billions of hairs they measured and stuff like that. We were doing bootstrap analyses, and we did a mixed model bootstrap for the data they had. And I just got a nice note from somebody about non-parametric Bayesian analysis, and I was realizing the bootstrap is a lot like that. That is, the bootstrap distribution is a lot like often like a posterior distribution from a non-parametric prior. And I've tried to make that stick. It's not easy, but I think it does.
Didn't Don Rubin call the bootstrap a poor man's Bayes? I remember that correctly?
Yeah, when I was writing the little monograph, which I still have on my desk. I always like that little monograph. Don contributed the Bayesian bootstrap, which uses exponentials instead of resampling, and I thought that was a good idea, and it's remarkably the same as the simple bootstrap.
We left Stanford in 1984, and I came back in 1994, 10 years later, and there was this horde of people who were doing theoretical work on the bootstrap and validating it. People, faculty in the department, and people in the rest of the world. And it was just amazing, and there were really strong results, like the bootstrap T, asymptotic results and things like that. It's amazing how it's become a standard tool.
Yeah, there's been more than 1,000 papers, serious papers on it. And then Rob and I wrote the book, the little green book, which has absorbed, incidentally, most of the citations that I have for the bootstrap. The book has something like 50,000 citations. The paper itself has something like 20,000. And so the book has been, we sell it, it keeps selling. And
what I'm hoping is at some point people will forget that it's your bootstrap and they'll say it's mine. Tibshirani's bootstrap.
It's a classic. Everyone wants it. Yeah.
Okay, and so another thing to say about the bootstrap, I think, is it's very much a Sequoia Hall kind of thing, because the combination of people like Rupert and Lincoln and people like Charles and Chernoff working on my mind had an awful lot to do with the thing developing.
What did Charles think of the bootstrap? Did you ever talk to him? What did Charles Stein think of the bootstrap? Did you ever talk to him about it?
Well, one of the, okay, there's another one more story. One day I went into Rupert Miller's office, and he had the office next to Charles down in Old Sequoia Hall, and on the wall on his blackboard, and up in the corner, written in Charles' unmistakable, beautiful script that he wrote in, was a strange inequality with a question mark after it. And I looked at that, and I went back to my office, and I realized that it had something to do with the jackknife. And then I worked on it, and a couple of days later, I showed it to Charles. The only time I think he's ever been impressed by something I did, and that we wrote the paper about the jackknife inequality and so on. And then that got into the bootstrap some, but the bootstrap is the kind of thing, it's unaesthetic. That was Chuki's main objection, was that the jackknife is aesthetically pleasing, and the bootstraps, involves random sampling and stuff like that. It's not symmetric. Anyway, Chuki at one point approached me and said he wanted to write a paper together, and I ran for the. I admired Chuki very much, but he was an intellectual bully, and I knew how this was going to turn out.
Well, the bootstrap's also today part of one of the most important machine learning tools, which is the random forest. And the bootstrap's in there, and it's put to good use.
Except they call it bagging. They try not to use the word bootstrap in there.
That's
no, I really like that.
We know.
The random forest thing is a great idea, and I didn't give it enough appreciation at the time it came out, because Leo used such extreme language that it's a good lesson. If you want people to use your stuff, talk in a way that they can understand it, or at least I can understand it. But it's a great idea, and it's very effective. I love using it.
Well, we love
it's sort of been obscured right now by the big success about deep learning and things like that.
Yeah. It's just a temporary thing, I think.
Still very useful, yeah.
But anyway, we love the bootstrap, and everyone we talk to loves the bootstrap.
Yeah, the thing. I find amazing, like when I talk to people in the med school, postdocs, they all say, and I bootstrap. It's a tool they know and they use all the time without me even mentioning it. So it's become just part of the culture. The culture.
Good. It hasn't made me a rich man, I'll tell you that, but it's made me happier.
Well, okay, lovely talking with you, Brad.
Yeah, this is a really good project on your part. I'd like to see some of the other ones.
Sure. Well,
that you do.
Happy to show you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Over and out.
Bye-bye.
Bye.